Today, I'll be telling you about a series of events that happened in Nashville, Tennessee in 1997 and became known as the Nightmare of Nashville, and for a good reason. This story is horrifying and saddening, and possibly unlike any other case that I've told you about before. The case has since been solved, but this hasn't made its consequences easier on anybody. Nashville is the largest city in the state of Tennessee. In the 1990s, aspiring country singers who wanted to make a career for themselves were drawn to Nashville, which became a mecca of sorts for all those who enjoyed country music. Among those who arrived in the city in hope of fame were not only good-natured citizens, but also the occasional dangerous criminals. One of them started roaming the streets of Nashville in February 1997. On February 16, 1997, a Sunday morning, the 25-year-old Steve Hampton, manager at a Captain D's restaurant, went to work leaving his wife and children at home. That morning, Sarah Jackson also went to the same restaurant. She was 16, and this was her first job, which she did part-time to earn some money while in high school. February 16th was supposed to be an ordinary workday. At around 8:15 a.m., Steve's phone rang. It was his boss who was calling him about sales figures. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing the store for opening. At around 8:54 a.m., a woman named Debbie was driving by and noticed a young man in a Captain D's apron standing in the entrance to the restaurant and holding the door open for another man dressed in ordinary clothing while the two were talking. Over an hour later, Michael Butterworth, another restaurant employee, arrived at work but couldn't enter the restaurant because the doors were locked. Butterworth called Steve, but nobody answered. Realizing that something was wrong, he got in touch with another colleague whose father was a police officer. At 11 a.m., the police entered the restaurant. At first, everything inside seemed normal, nothing unusual. One of the police officers looked around and noticed that the door to the walk-in cooler was open. He entered and saw Steve and Sarah lying face down on the floor. The attacker had used a .32 caliber weapon, most likely a revolver. $7,140 were stolen from the cash register, including $250 in coins. Also missing was Steve's wallet, where he had $600 that he intended to use to pay rent. The police went over to Steve's house to inform his family of what had happened. A female officer knocked on the door, which was soon opened by Steve's wife, Deanna Hampton. The officer said, "Miss Hampton, there has been an unfortunate incident. The restaurant has been robbed. Steve is dead." After hearing the first two sentences, Deanna was worried, but rested assured that she would overcome anything. But when she heard of Steve's death, she didn't know whether to scream or to faint. She lost contact with reality and remembered nearly nothing of what happened afterwards. She only recalled how the police kept telling her, "You have to explain this to the children so that they find out before people start arriving at your house." Her brain must have repressed all the other memories, because as Deanna herself said later on, she would never again want to see the look on her children's faces at that moment, and would rather not remember such things. Nonetheless, photos of Steve and Sarah would continue haunting their relatives. The tragedy became the city's most important news, and the victims' photos often appeared on TV. Sarah's mother was returning from church with her youngest son when she was told the horrible news. The police officer had carefully said that the restaurant was robbed. When the woman asked if Sarah was alive, he answered firmly that she was not. The woman immediately contacted her pastor, who quickly arrived at her house. An investigation was launched. It turned out that the woman who drove by the Captain D's at 8:50 a.m. on her way to church had seen Steve Hampton in the restaurant's doorway, talking to another man who was holding a piece of paper. She described him as dark-haired and somewhat taller than Steve. At around 9:30 a.m., another passerby noticed a suspicious-looking car parked in front of the restaurant. He described the car as small and said it had been parked in the opposite direction of the flow of traffic. He also noticed an unidentified man running from the restaurant to the car. They had even exchanged glances at some point, after which the stranger lowered his head to make him more difficult to recognize. He got into the car from the passenger's side. The witness portrayed him as tall and muscular, with a burly neck, dark eyebrows and eyes, and thick, slicked back hair. He was wearing a white shirt, black trousers, and an old pair of white tennis shoes. On the next day, the witness learned of the murders and called the police several times to tell them what he saw, but the police never contacted him back. So the investigation had been launched, but wasn't getting anywhere due to the lack of evidence. All the investigators had were a couple of witnesses and a shoe print inside the restaurant. A remuneration of $45,000 was offered to anyone who could provide information as to the identity of the culprit. However, soon after the murders, Steve Hampton's driver's license and a movie rental card, gifted to him by a colleague, were found alongside Ellington Parkway, 11.5 miles away from the restaurant. This could be of great help to solving the case. The movie rental card had an unidentified thumbprint on it. It would take a lot of time to search for suspects though, while the murderer would resume his killing spree in a mere 6 weeks. On March 23, 1997, the 911 rescue service received a strange call. A male voice was whispering a plea for help and saying he couldn't speak English. He couldn't give an address or his name. It seemed he was losing consciousness. The 911 employee traced the call to a McDonald's on Lebanon Road and sent a team there. The officers who had arrived on the scene witnessed a horrifying image. The restaurant was squeaky clean, except for large pools of blood on the terracotta-colored floors. In the storage room, they discovered 4 people with gunshot and knife wounds, 1 woman and 3 young men. The officers examined the victims. The young woman still had a pulse. They swiftly took her to the hospital. She was later identified as the 17-year-old Andrea Michelle Brown. They also examined the man who was repeatedly stabbed and found that he was still alive. His name was Jose Gonzalez, and he was the one who called 911. The doctors in the ER were astonished at how lucky he was. He had been stabbed 17 times, yet none of his vital organs had been hit. 2 victims had a chance of surviving. The other 2, Robert Allen Sewell and Ronald Santiago, were not so lucky and were dead by the time the police had arrived. Now the investigators had hoped that the survivors could tell them what happened, and thus help in catching the culprit. An examination of the crime scene found that the attacker had used a .25 caliber weapon and fired a total of 6 shots. He also took $3,000 from the cash register. In the hospital, the 17-year-old Andrea was put on a life support machine. The doctors hoped to return her to consciousness, but after several tests had to pronounce her brain dead. On March 24th, her parents made the difficult decision to take her off life support in spite of her young age. Andrea had told her friends many times that she would like to become an organ donor after her death, and her parents honored her wish. Later on, her father would say with a heavy heart and a better voice that the lives of several people were saved thanks to Andrea. The investigation continued. A special hotline was created to gather information about the attacker, and over 1,000 calls were made to it in the first days after its creation. However, the culprit wasn't among all the people that the callers had pointed to. And then, on March 25th, something very odd happened. The investigators issued a statement where they said that there wasn't any evidence to directly link the Captain D's murders and the incident in the McDonald's. However, soon Detective Pat Pastiglione met Matt Rowland, who was working on the first case, and after comparing their notes, they realized they were looking for the same person. After all, the 2 restaurants were located very close to each other, and the crime scenes were identical except for what was done to Jose, but that was most likely simply because the attacker had run out of bullets. The police started investigating both cases, working for 16 hours a day without a day off for weeks. Meanwhile, Pat Pastiglione and Mike Rowland, together with an interpreter, went to the hospital to see Jose Gonzalez, who had woken up. He couldn't speak because of a tube in his mouth, but he could make signs with his hands to answer simple questions, and this was enough. He was asked how many attackers there were. He answered that there was only one, a white man. He had dark hair and mustache, a muscular build, and no excess weight. He was wearing a baseball cap and a jean jacket. The last thing Jose remembered before losing consciousness was phoning 911. Thanks to Jose's testimony, the police managed to create a sketch of the suspect, which was made public on March 29th. Having miraculously survived, Jose was released from hospital on April 4th. The police had high hopes for catching the killer, fueled by the fact that there was a surveillance camera installed on the other side of the street. But it soon turned out that it wasn't turned on. The hope dissipated quickly. Investigators raided restaurants in the area and installed dozens of surveillance cameras. They ordered each employee to put a special sticker on their car so that they could immediately recognize whose vehicles were in the restaurant's parking lot and whether there were any intruders at closing hour. Policemen even went undercover in local restaurants, posing as employees in the hope that the killer would choose that place for his next attack. But this tactic didn't bring anything. On April 23, 1997, just after 10 p.m., a young man named Craig Mace drove to a Baskin Robbins ice cream store in Clarksville, Tennessee, to pick up his sister Michelle. He knew that she would finish work somewhere between 10:10 and 10:40 p.m. and see his car in the parking lot, being aware that he would come pick her up. When he arrived, he saw the car of Michelle's colleague Angela in the parking lot. The outside lights of the store were off, but the lights inside were on. He decided to wait. After 15 minutes, the women were still nowhere to be seen. He had a closer look and realized that there was nobody in the store. He decided to go in. It was quiet inside, partly lit and partly dark. Nobody in the work area, the storeroom, the freezer, only static noise on the surveillance monitors. Mortified, he called 911 but got no response. He then phoned his parents. His sister Kelly called Angela Holmes' husband, Tabaris, and explained that they couldn't get in contact with Angela or the store. Tabaris immediately drove to the Baskin Robbins, arriving there in about 10 minutes. The police would only arrive around 20 minutes after the call, already the third one made by Craig to 911. Inside the store, the cash register was empty and the surveillance videotape was gone. Everything else, including the missing women's purses, was in place. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle. The women had simply disappeared. The next morning, a massive search started for Angela and Michelle. It was at this time that a man named Jack Hackett was walking his dog around a lake in Dunbar Cave Park about 50 miles away from Nashville. Suddenly, his dog tugged sharply at its leash. It had smelled something and was leading its owner towards the lake where the body of a young woman lay, hands tied behind her back. Hardly believing what he saw, the man called 911. The police arrived, cordoned off the area, and soon found a second body, also that of a young woman with hands tied behind her back. She lay in the forest, a pair of rubber gloves next to her. Soon thereafter, Michelle's brother Craig got a phone call. It was his friend who often listened in on police radio waves and had overheard them talk about the gruesome discovery in the park. Craig immediately set off to the park. He had seen this coming. Tabaris, Angela's husband, also drove there. In the park, he met a policeman who couldn't let him beyond the yellow line, but told him the terrible news. It was in this park that Tabaris and Angela had got married, and now, by a cruel twist of fate, she lay dead on its cold ground. The doctor who had performed the autopsy stated that the women had survived for up to 15 minutes after being stabbed, and that they would have been conscious for approximately 80% of the time before death. The investigators determined the route by which the women might have ended up in the park and started looking for witnesses. It turned out that a woman driving by Baskin Robbins at 9:45 p.m. had seen a red car in the store's parking lot. Michelle's ex-boyfriend, Jerry Perdue, worked not far from there and told the police that he also saw a red car in the parking lot as he was slowly driving past the Baskin Robbins on his way home from work at 10:07 p.m. He saw that some of the lights inside the store were on and also recalled a mop bucket standing on the floor. At 10:30, Dunbar Cave Park was about to close. This was when a young couple who lived across the street from an entrance to Dunbar Cave saw a red car parked incorrectly in the local parking lot. This was all the investigation had yielded so far. The city was terrified. People were filled with mourning for the dead and fear for themselves. While the detectives were hard at work, ordinary people left letters, flowers, and plush toys at the ill-fated Baskin Robbins. There was no doubt that this crime was perpetrated by the same person who had robbed the 2 other restaurants. However, there were still no suspects. 2 more months would pass before the mystery of the fast food killer would be solved. On June 25, 1997, Mitchell Roberts, a manager at Shoney's restaurant, was at home with his family when all of a sudden someone knocked at the door. He was surprised to see his ex-employee Paul Reid standing on the doorstep. Mitchell had fired him from his position as dishwasher at Shoney's in February after Reid had thrown a dish at a colleague, only a day before the Captain D's robbery. The main door to Roberts' house was open, but the screen door was locked. Through it, one could see a tall man standing on the doorstep. At the time, Mitchell's son had been videotaping their dog, and having heard a knock at the door, automatically turned the camera towards the entrance. Paul Reid waved towards the camera. Mitchell's wife whispered to her husband, "Can you get rid of this guy? He scares me. There's something wrong with him." Mitchell came to the door, said hello, and invited Paul in. Having stepped inside, Paul had a look around and started speaking. He excused himself for his behavior on February 15th, explained that he had lost it that day, and asked to get his job back. Mitchell explained that it wasn't his decision and that Paul would first have to talk to the head of HR. Paul didn't like this answer. His eyes darkened and filled with rage. Mitchell suggested they go outside. Paul agreed, and once they were outside, he turned around and said, "Mitch, I can show you evidence that your own employees are stealing from your restaurant." He then invited him to accompany him to his car, where he had something to show him. Paul opened the trunk. Inside were several Shoney's steak boxes. It was at this point that Mitchell realized Reid had a red car just like the one seen at all the recent crime scenes. He said, "Okay, thanks, Paul. Talk to you on Monday." He turned around and walked towards the house. Paul rushed after him, a gun in his hand. He demanded that Mitchell let himself be handcuffed and get inside his car. Mitchell understood everything. He had to save himself as quickly as possible, for in the house behind his back were his wife and children. He began explaining to Paul in a calm voice that he would arrange everything and that there was no need for threats. All the while, he was backing away very slowly towards the house. Once he was close enough, he rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind him and almost literally kicking out Reid, who had tried to get in after him. Mitchell shouted to his wife, "Get the gun out! It's over here!" Paul tugged at the door handle but got scared of the gun, ran towards his car and left. This was a very convincing bluff on Mitchell's part. He never did own a gun. Mitchell called the police, and when they arrived, he said that he had never before seen Paul behave like that and was sure that he was the one responsible for what happened in the restaurants. And right at the moment when the police were at Mitchell's house, his phone rang. It was Paul. Mitchell didn't want to answer, but one of the policemen told him in a whisper to try to get Reid to return here. Mitchell picked up the phone. Paul started apologizing for the incident, saying he didn't know what came over him, pleading Mitchell to forget about what had happened. Mitchell played along, saying, "Paul, I got an idea. Why don't you come back to my place and discuss everything? I understand things aren't going well for you now. We'll open a bottle of something, have a drink, and talk everything over calmly." Mitchell held his breath. "Okay, Mitch, thanks. I'm coming." As soon as Reid arrived, he was met not only by good old Mitch, but by a squad of policemen. Paul was arrested. Soon, Jose Gonzalez, who had survived the McDonald's robbery, would identify him, pointing to his photograph with a finger that was trembling from fear. This would become the key piece of evidence against Reid, alongside the thumbprint that was found on the movie rental card belonging to the Captain D's manager. Now, let's continue on to the question, who is Paul Reid? Paul Dennis Reid Jr. was born on November 12, 1957 in Richland Hills, a suburb of the Texas city of Fort Worth, in a family of law-abiding laborers. He was the third and youngest child of Josephine Mary and Paul Reid Sr. His older sisters were named Linda and Janet. As a child, Reid was diagnosed with a congenital abnormality in his left ear. Later on, several experts will link this to a possible dysfunction in the left temporal lobe. During his younger years, Paul suffered from impaired hearing, a condition that his parents preferred not to notice. In general, his development lagged behind that of other children his age. For instance, he couldn't put words into even the simplest sentences until he turned 3. In 1960, Paul's parents divorced. His father received formal custody over Paul and his sister Janet, but wasn't really involved in raising the children due to heavy drinking and long working hours. His jobs included private investigator, car mover, and a security guard. Because of this, after their parents divorced, the Reid children soon started living with their 70-year-old paternal grandmother in Oak Forest. She was named Josephine like Reid's mother and was a very conservative and religious woman who lived a simple life. However, even though she did her best, Paul was impossible to control. His behavior went far beyond the usual childish mischief. In those days, ADHD wasn't a common diagnosis, but nowadays that's probably what he would have been diagnosed with. He began stealing from the neighbors' mailboxes and clotheslines as soon as he was tall enough to reach them. At only 4 years old, he stole a men's wallet in a store. He was abusive to every living thing, from animals to other children. Sometimes he would be punished, provided grown-ups were able to catch him, since he often ran away in hidden trees, on roofs, or on top of garages. Exasperated, his grandmother would tie him to a chair lest he create yet another disaster. From the very start, Paul was hostile towards his grandmother. One day, Josephine was standing at the stove stirring a pot of noodle stew. She was about to take a sip of it, but suddenly dropped the spoon, horrified. The soup had nails in it. Little Paul was sitting beside her and smiling. But this wasn't the worst of it. For instance, at one point, Paul grabbed a baseball bat and killed his grandmother's dog with it. Later on, Josephine woke up from the smell of smoke and saw that her bat was on fire. It turned out that while she was sleeping, Paul had set fire to her blanket and run away. He was only 5 years old. At around the same time, another child hit him in the head with a brick. After the incident, Paul would sometimes feel dizzy and have flashes of anger. This would be the first of many head injuries that Paul would sustain, including a bicycle fall and a car crash. When Paul was 7, his stepmother enrolled him at school. A school psychologist diagnosed him with minimal cerebral dysfunction, which was supposed to explain both his behavior and learning disabilities. His grandmother's patience ran out after he threw a salt shaker against her ear. She talked to a priest who recommended that the 8-year-old Paul be sent to a boys' home. Josephine got his father involved, who in the end sent his son to the Bernard Bailyn Boys' Home in Houston. It was less of a boarding school and more of a place for irredeemable children that posed a danger to society. Paul's mother found out about this decision unwittingly when her signature was needed to declare her son a ward of the state. She took him back into her home. So as not to use her ex-husband's name in the house, she started calling her son Paul Leon Moraz after her second husband, but only unofficially. His papers remained as they were. The daughters that Joni had with her second husband remember her as a good, loving woman who worked a lot and did all she could for her children. Paul, however, described his own childhood as difficult and claimed his puritanical mother practiced unacceptable parenting methods. He started going to a special education primary school that was mostly attended by black children. He made friends with them, not paying any attention to the racial tensions that were rampant in the country at the time. Paul couldn't read and had no idea of what was going on in politics and with the issue of civil rights. A year later, he was put into a different, white school. Paul began making friends there, and when he was 12 years old, he even had his first kiss at some home party organized by a girl from his class. His behavioral problems continued, however, so at one point he was prescribed the psychoactive drug Equinol. After an initial positive effect, the doctors decided to increase the dosage, but this resulted in speech complications, so dosage was turned back. In high school, he began studying with ordinary kids. He claimed he was popular with the girls, but at the same time he actively engaged in sports because he was afraid of bullying from his classmates. At some point, he had the nickname Special Ed due to his past education. In the mid-60s, he watched Jack LaLanne's show a lot and aspired to be like him, preferring the gym to smoking and drinking. In high school, he met a boy named Stuart Cook, who would later play an important role in Paul's criminal career. In 1971, when Paul was 13, his mother divorced her second husband. A year earlier, Paul had started helping out in his mother's restaurant. Joni's new boyfriend would become a stepfather to Paul and his sisters, though some sources allege that his relations with his newfound daughters were far from fatherly. There were even court records of sexual violence perpetuated by him, but also by Paul, who at the age of 16 had harassed his sisters and his mother. He also often ran away from home. Paul recounted his teenage years to be nearly idyllic, though in fact he was constantly getting caught stealing, joyriding, and fighting. His father preferred to ignore everything that was going on with his family and children. Meanwhile, Paul started playing truant from school, instead taking drugs together with his aunt at her place. After he attempted to sexually harass her, she kicked him out. At 16, Paul was convicted of car theft and given a suspended sentence of 3 years. He would sometimes miss school, sometimes return to it, or try to get the occasional job. Finally, in 1997, he earned his GED from San Jacinto College in Pasadena, Texas. In 1979, he worked as a security guard at a large bank in Houston, an especially curious development given his criminal past. Afterwards, he completed a 9-month-long program at a career college and got a job as an industrial mechanic in a company that sold oil equipment. It was in 1979 that he met his future wife, Jessica Neal. One of Paul's sisters had tried to talk her out of marrying him, but the wedding took place nonetheless. Paul was extremely controlling towards his wife, sometimes even locking her at home without any means of communication when he left. He wasn't interested in her fate. After getting married, Paul evidently decided to take up watermelon farming. It was at this time that different products needed for growing watermelons began disappearing from stores all over town. There is no information as to where the investigation of these thefts had led. Reid continued racking up a crime record. Several times he forged bank checks. After robbing a grocery store in 1978, he underwent assessment in a psychiatric hospital instead of being sent to prison. Together with his school friend Stuart Cook, they continued robbing restaurants because Reid had excellent knowledge of where such places kept their safes with earnings. The two were very aggressive in their conduct, waving firearms around and threatening everybody with them. Naturally, there were lots of witnesses. In 1982, Paul was accused of aggravated armed robbery of 4 restaurants and 1 general store. The prosecutor on his case was a man named Brian Johnson. 15 years later, Paul would meet him again, this time in Nashville. During the court hearings, Paul behaved extravagantly. He would demonstratively fall onto the defendant's bench, attempt to attack people, and at some point even made a paper hat which he put on his attorney's head. He underwent another psyche evaluation, which deemed him mentally fit and legally capable. In 1984, he received a 20-year prison sentence. His wife left him and got a divorce while he was in jail. However, he didn't seem to suffer much while in prison. Instead, he made a reputation by giving out advice to other inmates. For example, get a haircut and dress smart so that people don't suspect you. During this time, Reid developed paranoia, started believing that he was under personal surveillance from the US government. He also wrote letters to the prosecutor offering to snitch on other inmates in exchange for a lessening of his prison sentence. The prosecutor ignored the letters. In 1990, Paul was released on parole, against the recommendation of several experts, and had to report to a parole officer once a month. The reason for his early release were overcrowded conditions in the prison where he was being held. As he was leaving jail, Paul swore that he would do everything right the next time and leave no witnesses. He kept this gruesome promise. After his parole, Paul went to Dallas, where he worked as a truck driver delivering textiles. In November of 1990, he was involved in a serious car crash and subsequently received $25,000 in a workers' comp settlement. He used this money to get braces, a nose job, and various other plastic surgery. Reid dreamed of becoming a country singer, and after altering his appearance, began learning to play the guitar. As for his vocals, he thought they were comparable to Hank Williams Sr. and Garth Brooks. He made several demo recordings and ordered a professional photographic portfolio, taking the stage name Justin Parks. Reid wanted to go to the Mecca of country music, the city of Nashville. By this point, he only had to make visits to his parole officer once a year, a requirement that he followed duly. According to Joseph Yates' book, When Nashville Bled, Paul would occasionally visit an elderly woman in Fort Worth named Dorothy Madeline, from whom he used to rent a room. It was then that he wrote a 13-page long letter explaining that his mind and body were being controlled by the government, and that they would likely force him to commit violent acts. He then prepared 400 envelopes for multiple copies of the letter and went out for a walk with Dorothy, handing out the letters to people on the street and in the local courthouse. He asked people to send those letters to newspapers, magazines, and TV channels, and wished for his story to end up on the table of Texas Governor Ann Richards and in the office of the Washington Post. Most of the letters that he handed out, however, landed in the trash. The locals had grown rather used to vagrants and crackpots roaming the streets. Paul moved to Oklahoma, where he wanted to go to music school. He worked in a bakery, went to the local gym, and tried singing in his spare time. He bought expensive guitars and found himself a girlfriend, who also had to listen to his ravings about him being monitored by the government. The woman soon ended the relationship because she was unnerved by his temper and suspected him of having a sexual interest in her 5-year-old daughter. This was the most likely reason for his departure from Oklahoma. Back in Nashville, Reid's musical career wasn't taking off, so he got a job as a dishwasher in a Shoney's restaurant. When applying for jobs, he lied about his date of birth so that his potential employers wouldn't be able to find him in the police databases. He tried to behave like a regular nice guy, be sociable, polite, hardworking. Whether it was some dark calculation or simply an attempt to show off, Paul would openly show compassion for the victims of crimes and terrorist attacks that he heard of on the news. For this reason, the people around him didn't find him to be suspicious. On February 15, 1997, however, Paul lost his temper and threw a plate at his colleague, a Filipino woman, which caused him to be fired from Shoney's. Paul felt that he was treated unfairly, and this became the last straw. What followed was a string of horrifying crimes. Curiously enough, he had discussed the idea of getting rich through armed robbery several times with his colleagues, but nobody took his musings seriously. He had, however, already acquired several firearms. Now that we understand who we're dealing with, let's follow his movements during the days of the robberies. This time, let's focus on the people who had the misfortune to meet him face to face. The first place that Reid chose was the Captain D's, where Steve Hampton worked as a manager. On the morning of February 16th, he went to work, leaving his wife and children at home. He adored his family, but he also loved his job and the company of his colleagues. Steve started his career at Captain D's when he was only 15 and worked tirelessly to finally become the restaurant's manager. The Captain D's team was very tightly knit. He would often play Monopoly at Steve's place, and he would sometimes work a shift for his employees if they needed to prepare for exams or spend a holiday with their families. His team found him to be a unifying and inspirational force. Steve liked working there, even though he didn't earn a lot of money and his family led a simple life. Steve's favorite pastime was watching movies. One day he went to rent a movie with his friend and colleague Donald Carter, and it turned out that Steve's movie rental card had a debt on it that he couldn't pay off at that moment. So his friend Donald suggested ordering a card in his name so that they could get a movie without Steve having to pay the penalty. This friendly gesture saved the evening and later would give a key to solving the murder case. That ill-fated Sunday, high school student Sarah Jackson was working together with Steve. Sarah's family was very religious and active in the local parish. As a child, Sarah sang in the church choir and participated in religious plays. She grew up to be a beautiful young woman with dark hair and brown eyes. As soon as she was old enough to get a job, she asked her parents to allow her to do so. She longed for responsibility and independence. In May 1996, she started working at Captain D's. Her new manager, Steve, treated her like family and recommended, as he did to all of his employees, that she get a college degree so as not to work in fast food all of her life. Sarah was an excellent employee. She dreamed of buying a car with her earnings, and she succeeded. In February 1997, Sarah acquired a 1989 blue Pontiac Grand Am for $2,000. That Sunday was supposed to be another ordinary working day at Captain D's. After a call from his boss, Steve went to the door where he saw Paul Reid. He was planning to get inside the restaurant by pretending to be interested in getting a job there. He had visited the place several days earlier, asking if there were any vacant positions, wanting to fill out an application form. It was with this form that he was currently standing before Steve. His true intentions became evident very quickly. As soon as the door opened for him, he took out his gun and went inside. Sarah was in the storage room and didn't see what was happening in the main hall. When she turned around, a gun was pointing straight at her. Steve said he had $600 in his wallet and asked the attacker to take them and not hurt Sarah. But Reid wanted more. He put on a pair of gloves and told his hostages to open the safe. After clearing out its contents, he gestured with his gun towards the floor, making Sarah and Steve kneel with their backs to him. The last thing they heard were gunshots. 2 bullets didn't touch Sarah's skull, only grazing her scalp. The 3rd bullet hit her spine, but the wound wasn't fatal. When Reid was getting the tape out of the surveillance system, Sarah moved, trying to prop herself up. Reid saw this, reloaded his gun, and this time he didn't miss. 2 days later, Reid used the acquired money to buy a car. It was this vehicle that he drove to McDonald's on March 23rd. One of the workers of the McDonald's on Lebanon Road was a man named Ronald Santiago. He had moved to the USA from Puerto Rico in the hope of living the American dream. He was a nice guy who had learned to cook from his mother. She believed it was an important skill for everyone. While in college, he met a woman named Yvette who would become his wife and gave him a child. In 1992, Ronald worked as a chef in a pizza parlor until his brother told him he had a horrible dream. He saw Ronald get shot during a robbery at the restaurant. Ronald's brother asked him to quit his job. Ronald was surprised. Leave because of some dream. Nonetheless, he soon quit the job and started working in a store, then in a McDonald's, then in a hotel. When he was 27, he returned to the McDonald's to work as the restaurant's manager. When his brother found out about this, he was horrified. He still vividly recalled his dream and asked Ronald's wife to warn him. The second employee who had the ill fortune to be on the shift that day was Jose Gonzalez. He had recently emigrated from Mexico to the United States in search of a better life. He hardly spoke any English, living in the country illegally with his brother. He got lucky with his job. He could speak Spanish with the manager Ronald, since he was from Puerto Rico. On Jose's very first day at work, while he was learning the basics, Ronald told him, "In case of an emergency, pick up the phone, call 911 and say, 'I don't speak English. Please help me.'" Robert Allen Sewell, one of their colleagues, was a well-meaning if somewhat shy young man. He was cautious, however, and often carried a weapon on him, ready to defend his friends if something should happen. He was 25 years old. The woman who worked with them that day was called Andrea Michelle Brown, and she was the oldest child in her family. When she was 11, her parents divorced, and Andrea lived together with her father and sister. She grew up to be a beautiful golden-haired woman, very diligent and smart. Her family was not religious, so her parents let Andrea and her sister choose what to believe and what church to go to. Andrea became attracted to the Baptist church. She would occasionally go there alone and read the Bible. After she got her driver's license, she decided that she wanted to buy a car, so she got a job at the McDonald's that was on her way to school to earn the money needed. When she found out about the tragic incident at the local Captain D's, she called a friend and confessed that she was now afraid of going to work. Her friend went to the same school as did Sarah Jackson, so both of the girls were terrified. Andrea decided that she would quit her job once she had enough money for a car. Indeed, soon she bought a used Honda Accord for $1,500. A generally cheerful person, Andrea was overjoyed, but on March 22, 1997, she came into school saddened. In a serious manner, she started asking her classmates if they would attend her funeral. They were surprised that she would even ask such a question, but it turned out Andrea had a dream where she was killed. Sounds hard to believe, but I'm not making this up. We took all the information in this video from a book with detailed accounts of the lives of Reid's victims. It is of course quite eerie that two persons involved in today's story had such dreams. Perhaps, of course, Andrea was simply having a hard time coping with what had happened to Sarah Jackson. On March 23, 1997, Andrea unexpectedly got called into work. They needed someone to stay there till closing time. Overjoyed to be needed, she got into her car and went to the restaurant. She was only 17 years old at the time. Her colleague Ronald also wasn't initially supposed to be working that day, but he agreed to cover for a co-worker who had fallen ill. Robert was thinking about taking a day off from his shift because he wasn't feeling well and had discussed the idea with his family. As for Jose, it was only his third day on the job. The young employees were cleaning up in the restaurant before closing. After finishing, they locked the place and went out when Andrea recalled she had forgotten something inside. Ronald opened the front door for her and waited for her to pick up what she needed. As he turned away from the door, he saw a looming dark figure right in front of him. It was Paul Reid, and he was holding a gun. He demanded that Ronald ask all the employees back in, or he would start shooting. By this time, Nashville already lived in fear, especially employees of restaurants and cafes who were leaving their jobs in the dozens. The McDonald's was only a few miles away from the ill-fated Captain D's. Realizing all of this, Ronald called his colleagues back in. Once they returned, Reid locked the door behind them. He demanded that they give all the money they had. Ronald took the money out of the safe and put it in a bag. Reid then told them to go to the storage room. A string of gunshots ensued. However, when everyone else lay lifeless on the floor and it was Jose's turn to be executed, Reid ran out of bullets. Having realized this, Jose attacked Reid, but Paul grabbed a knife. This was how Jose got the 17 stab wounds. Bleeding out, he played dead. Once the attacker left, Jose reached for the phone and called 911. He then phoned his family and told them he was in trouble. As we know, in the end he survived. The others unfortunately did not. When Ronald's brother learned of the tragedy, he was dumbfounded. His dream had come true, as had Andrea's dream. Andrea's funeral was attended by all of her friends. Meanwhile, Reid wasn't planning to stop. He had a visit to Baskin Robbins ahead of him. Among the employees at the Baskin Robbins were two young women named Michelle and Angela. Michelle was lovely and expressive dark-haired woman who enjoyed life in all of its aspects. She loved to have fun and dreamed of becoming famous. She would get into scrapes occasionally. For example, once she literally fell out of the car because she didn't buckle up properly. That might be the reason why when she was 18 years old, a year before her death, she wrote instructions for family and friends concerning what to do if she should unexpectedly die. She described the music she wanted at her funeral, explained what to do with her belongings, and asked to put a comb with her in her coffin. Her friends would find the 4 pages of this makeshift testament when sorting through her room. Michelle loved to write, composed poems, and had a notebook where she would jot down observations and thoughts. Angela Holmes was born on September 4, 1975. From a young age, she was prudent and intelligent, and her parents were very proud of her. In high school, she met a guy named Tabaris, who would later become her boyfriend. He did military service in Korea and corresponded with Angela actively during this time. She had sent him over 300 letters. Angela received a scholarship to attend the University of Indiana and stayed in the mainland US when the rest of her family moved to Hawaii. Soon, she found out that she was pregnant. She told the exciting news to her close friend Amy and assured her that she would marry Tiberius. And she did, but the couple didn't have any money at the time, so their friends helped them out and organized the wedding ceremony in a park. Angela gave birth to their daughter and enrolled in college to become a nurse. She also got a part-time job during the evening shift in the local Baskin Robbins to be able to pay for college and raise their child. On April 23, 1997, Angela called her husband over and showed him where she kept all of her important documents. Surprised, he asked why she was doing this. She replied that he had to know where things were in case something was to happen to her. She then went into the kitchen, prepared enough food for several days, and froze it. She said she didn't know why she was doing it, but had a feeling there was something she had to do. That day, her shift started at 5 p.m. Angela left home, having said goodbye to her husband and daughter. At about the same time, her co-worker Michelle also left home. Their workday developed as usual. At around 9:25 p.m., one of their regular clients walked in, and they had a lively conversation with her. The woman saw the two employees washing the floors and wiping counters. At 9:45, Michelle received a call from her mother. Michelle asked her to make some potato soup for when she would arrive home. At first, her mother refused but agreed after some pleading from Michelle. At 9:58 p.m., the last customer left the Baskin Robbins. This was when Paul Reid appeared. The two young women noticed a tall male figure knocking on the closed door. At first, they ignored him, but he continued standing there. Angela decided he looked benevolent and opened the door in spite of the fact that they were already closing the store. He robbed the cafe using his usual scheme, but then heard Michelle saying that her brother was about to come pick her up, so he tied his hostages' hands, dragged them into his car, and took them to Dunbar Cave Park, an area he knew well. The park was empty. Hoping to escape, Michelle made a sharp turn to the left and started running. This was when she heard a horrible sound, the less gurgling breath of Angela, whose throat had been slit. Reid held her by her hair. Once he let go, her body fell into the water. Michelle continued running, but Paul caught up with her as well. 2 months later, on June 25, 1997, Reid arrived at the house of the Shoney's manager who had fired him earlier. That day, his blood-curdling career finally ended. One can only imagine how many lives would have been saved if he had not been prematurely released from prison on parole. The evidence against Reid was ironclad. Witnesses said they saw him wearing tennis shoes, and photographs of him wearing such shoes were found in his home. Yet the pair itself was missing, which could only mean one thing: he had gotten rid of them. It was his thumbprint on Steve Hampton's movie rental card. It was him who people had seen at the Captain D's the day he was trying to get a job there. Jose Gonzalez positively identified him. Traces of blood were found in his car. It was impossible to deny Reid's guilt. The problem was of a different sort. What kind of punishment to choose for such brutal killings? When Reid's trial started, the psyche evaluation stated that he had cognitive disorders, but this didn't change the course of things. Paul behaved eccentrically in court, continuously asserting that he was being monitored and had been made part of a government program intending to mind control US citizens. He publicly accused his defense team of being actors and refused to appeal the verdict. Later on, he did attempt to appeal some of the other verdicts, but he behaved irrationally. In spite of this, his lawyers didn't succeed in proving that he was mentally incompetent and unfit to make legal decisions on his own. During cross-interrogations, the prosecution claimed that Reid was a con artist, using a mental incompetency defense as a tactic to manipulate the court. Another challenge was how to pick the jury for these trials. The level of media coverage of the murders made it difficult to find impartial jurors. In 1999, as a result of the 3 trials, the first of which was even broadcast live on cable TV, Paul Reid was found guilty on 7 counts of murder and received 7 death sentences. His execution, however, was stayed multiple times, including an instance in 2003, just hours before the scheduled execution. His relatives and anti-death penalty activists continued claiming he was mentally handicapped, referring to his childhood injuries and arrested psychoverbal development, but were unsuccessful in mitigating the sentences. Unrelentingly, they filed several other motions, some successful and some not, appealing the death sentences, but in the end, the Supreme Court of Tennessee upheld the initial court decisions. In 2008, courts in Nashville and Clarksville held hearings to determine whether Paul was mentally incompetent. Both judges, however, ruled that there were no compelling reasons to change the sentence. Reid's lawyers were unable to prove his mental incompetence due to the fact that the experts that had testified had differing opinions on his mental capacity. Paul Reid died before he could be executed. In late October of 2013, he was taken to Nashville General Hospital as he was suffering from pneumonia complications. The families of his victims found out about this from the local news, and they were incensed. What if he was faking his illness in order to make an escape? Why wasn't anyone informed that he had been moved from the death row unit? Police officers had to guard Reid's hospital room so that nobody could get in. His sisters, however, could visit him. On November 1st, 2013, aged 55, Paul Reid died of pneumonia complications and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. There were rumors that he actually died of AIDS, but these were never verified. Reid spent a total of 14 years on death row. Interestingly, while the investigation was still in progress, suspicions arose that Reid may have been involved in another cafe robbery that took place in Palatine, Illinois in 1993. The incident was similar to those that happened in Tennessee in 1997, but this time Reid's alibi checked out and he was crossed off the list of suspects. It's truly heartbreaking when you think about the tragic fate of the young restaurant employees who simply wanted to clock out of their shift and return home. Write your own thoughts about the story in the comments. There is lots of information available pertaining to this case, podcasts, documentaries, and even a whole rather well-written book. I'll leave a link for you in the description. I traced together all the most important facts in this video, but of course, many details had been left out. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button and share it with your friends. And as always, stay safe.